Welcome back. A Bank of America equity strategist thinks the macro cycle remains favorable for equities in Canada. For more on that topic, let's go to that strategist. He is Ohsung Kwon, Canada and U.S. equity strategist at Bank of America Global Research. Ohsung, thank you very much for joining us. The TSX Composite, as you know, has had a very strong second half of 2024. Do you think the gains can continue into 2025?
Yeah, thanks for having me today. Yeah, I think the TSX can continue to rally into 2025. I think the macro environment is still pretty favorable, not just for the TSX, but equities in general. And I think the trade is really long North American cyclicals. As the previous guest was saying, I think the U.S. doing well is going to be beneficial for the TSX in general. But politics aside, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of optimism being built after the election here in the U.S. But politics aside, I think the big driver of that bullishness and then the recovery in fundamentals heading into 2025 is really going to be driven by the manufacturing cycle. And I think the manufacturing economy is going to come back in 2025 after 2 years of recession, basically, that we had, which was essentially the second, it was tied as the longest recession in history. And there are really three big drivers that I think are going to drive that manufacturing recovery into next year. Is first of all, I think that the destocking cycle of the inventory, that's at least the worst of it is over. Number two, the election uncertainty that we had in the U.S., that's over. And I think that's going to lead to companies unleashing their CapEx plans as we move into 2025. And lastly, even though there's still some uncertainty around rates are still down a lot from the peak of 5% here in the U.S. So rate pressure has somewhat eased, and I think that's really going to drive manufacturing recovery into next year.
Would that manufacturing recovery, benefit the Canadian auto parts makers? Those stocks have struggled for a while now, and they are down significantly so far this year. The likes of Magna International, Linamar, and Martin Rea.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about autos. It's more consumption driven. But for example, industrials and I think even financials are going to benefit from potential loan growth. And I think commodities could potentially participate if this actually broadens out to more of a global manufacturing cycle. That the jury is still out there whether this is going to broaden out to more of a global synchronized story. But at least in the U.S., we're pretty optimistic that the manufacturing cycle is going to come back, and that's going to benefit the Canadian economy and the TSX as well.
How do you see the tariff issue? And you know what we're referring to, the threat of Donald Trump to impose very steep tariffs on Canada, among other countries. I see that your economics team at Bank of America does expect what we refer to as the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. It's formerly known as the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement to remain intact despite these tariff threats.
Yeah, that's our house view. Our house view is that Canada is going to be safe from those tariff threats. But the headline risks are real. And what we saw back in 2018 and 19 was that whenever there were, threats of higher tariffs from the U.S., the Canadian equities typically underperform during those periods versus the U.S. So headline threats are real. So that could potentially provide some volatility in the TSX. Well, our view is that Canada is going to be safe from tariffs. And these two countries have to work together to enable reshoring, which is the ultimate goal of the U.S. to move the supply chain back to the U.S., Mexico, or Canada, North America. And I think, the reshoring is really a North American story. And I think the setup is pretty interesting that, we have a very strong consumer base in the U.S. We have cheap labor in Mexico, and we have all the commodities that we need in Canada. And I think those rail mergers that we saw during, Trump 1.0, and I think it's the renaming of NAFTA to USMCA. I think those are pretty telling signs that these three countries are really going to work together to enable reshoring.